Okay, so now that we have the historical income statement and the historical balance sheet results defined, we're going to now work in this template. This template has all the data that you've put in historically, as well as forecasts for the next 5 years. So as we've talked about earlier, the forecast period for annual models that serve as the foundation for valuation and mergers and acquisitions and leverage buyout analyses tend to be longer models. So 5 years, really anywhere from 3 to 7 to 8 years is the duration of a typical annual forecast model. Anything beyond that starts getting a little harder to justify in terms of forecasting. Anything shorter than that doesn't give you the cash flows and the forecasts that you need to really arrive at valuation conclusions. So let's look at what we've done. Everything here is the work you've done so far, and now I've really extended out using the EO month function the forecasts for Apple for the next 5 years. Now what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to forecast revenue down to EBITDA in this next step, except for 2 line items here on the income statement: interest income and interest expense. As I've alluded to earlier, interest income and interest expense really are going to need a more thorough review of where that's coming from. That really you're going to need, for example, with interest expense, you're going to need to understand what debt is going to look like. You're going to need to forecast debt to figure out what interest expense is. Interest income down the road, you're going to need to figure out what cash balances look like. This really comes at the end of our modeling exercise. Really at the very end, we're going to be able to figure this out. So we're going to leave this blank for now. Similarly with depreciation and amortization, that's not going to come quite at the very end, but it's going to come in the middle, because in order to calculate depreciation and amortization on a forecast basis, we need to forecast property, plant, equipment.
And so we now turn to an area below in the model, and a modeling best practice is to always cluster assumptions, key drivers in the model, as closely together as possible. So for example, here we're about to sort of kind of lay out the drivers for the income statement, the key assumptions that really forecast that income statement. We're going to keep them together right here. And so now we really turn to what are the revenue growth rates, the gross profit margins, the R&D as a percentage of sales, the tax rate. What should these things actually be? And we talked earlier about how quite often we rely on the expertise of those that have been thinking about the company that we're analyzing the most. And those tend to be, for public companies, sell-side research analysts. Again, the idea here is to frame what's called a base case, from which we will sensitize and come up with a weak case and a strong case. But we need a framework, or this is also called a street case. What is the general sort of street expectation around how this company is going to perform? Now, I should mention that for private companies, you don't have a street case. What you start relying on is management's forecasts themselves, and you call it a management case. In this situation, this is a public company. Apple is a well-known public company, and we are going to rely on the street case as the first thing that we put in. And then, of course, later on in the course, we are going to not only move away from that and sensitize it with a weak case and a strong case, but we're also going to dive a little bit deeper into where these numbers actually come from. How does, for example, a bank like JP Morgan, how does a sell-side research analyst actually arrive at these forecasts themselves? For now, let's now go back to the equity research report that I've provided you. Let me actually scroll up here. So this is a bunch of reports that we've given you around the time of this analysis. Remember, we're doing this analysis as of February 5th. You always want to search for the most recent equity research report as of the time of the analysis you're doing. There happens to be one the day before we're doing this analysis, and we are going to go there. And here you see this is what a typical report looks like. So for JP Morgan, you've got the research analysts, their associates, they're supporting that analyst's work. And usually at the very end of the research report is where a lot of the model screenshots are put in. Here it is here. So JP Morgan provides a screenshot of the model that they've built in Excel, and they really just paste it in here. And this is something that's distributed to the buy-side community who wants to really dig deeper into the underlying numbers that's sort of leading JP Morgan to say whether, they think Apple's a buy or a seller or whatever. And I don't know if you caught it a second ago, but Apple is a buy, according to this JP Morgan research report. They call it an overweight. We'll scroll back up there in a little bit and show you. There's a little on the top right. There was a little sign that said this is an overweight. And so here I've highlighted, this is from me. I've highlighted the sort of the part of the model that we're going to rely on. So you see here, the equity research report gives you 3 years of annual forecasts. And we're going to just put that in there. So revenue growth, JP Morgan forecasts to decline by 4% and then increase to 6.9% compared to what it's done in the past. It was 15.9% growth in the prior year. The year before that, there's actually interesting. This usually when the numbers don't quite jive to what's in the 10K, right? Because in the 10K we calculated growth of 215 to 229. That's 6.3%. Why does JP Morgan have it as a 6.6% growth rate? I'm guessing when JP Morgan put this data in back in 2017, you don't actually see what their underlying original base is because they stop at 2017, whereas we have 2016. But the reason it probably doesn't jive usually has to do with reclassifications of revenue. Revenue recognition rules have changed over the last couple of years, and so I'm guessing what Apple originally reported would show 6.6% revenue growth to get to 229, whereas in fact right now, due to the reclassifications, it's only showing 6.3. We don't have to worry too much about that. That's just something that's going to happen going forward. If you see a big change, you might have to go investigate. But given that the last actual year was exactly what we see, which is 15.9%, we're not going to dwell too much on it. But what we are going to put into here is the revenue growth rate forecast. And so what I want you to do is when we're wrapped up here and you're on your own, you plug in this data, 6 and 6.9%. I've pre-formatted this for you. And then you're coming up to a decision. Okay, I'm using JP Morgan research estimates through 2021, but what do I do going forward? So we've made the decision to sort of grow this in line with what the last historical growth rate is. Sometimes there are going to be reasons to say, no, I don't think revenue growth is going to be this high going forward. But again, you have to have a thesis on it. And if you don't have a thesis on it, unless the number is ridiculously high, something that is, unsustainable or whatever the case may be, we're just going to straight line it. And again, we're going to explore kind of the thinking around this a little bit later. For now, let's just get our numbers in place. And notice, by the way, this should technically also be formatted blue, but just for now, what I wanted to do is identify this as black, just so you can see that there is a distinction between the first 3 years that directly came from JP Morgan and the next 2 years came from really our own estimate, which is driven by not much other than we're just going to, we're assuming revenue is going to continue as is. The reason why I said technically it should be blue, because it is still a forecast. Even though this is a formula, this is a forecast that I should be able to sort of hover, change or whatever. And so when we're done with this model, we'll switch it back to blue. For now, just visually as a cue for you, I want you to understand these forecasts are slightly different. In other words, these are a little bit more reliable than these because they just kind of are going to come from our own thoughts here. So let's move on to gross profit margin. Notice, by the way, sometimes the way models are laid out don't always give you exactly what you need. So here you've got cost of sales, and you could have noticed that if I take cost of sales and divide it by revenue, that's really 1 minus gross profit margin. But I can also scroll down. I did a little bit of digging beforehand, and they did actually lay out the gross margin, not on the face of that initial screen grab, but they put it down here. So they did the math for us, and it's 37.8, 38.1, and 38.2. So we're going to do that as well. And just like before, I'm going to just forecast this going forward. And I'm a little bit more comfortable with this, to be honest with you. I worry a little bit about doing a forecast like this because revenue is such a key driver of everything that's going on. And 7% is pretty high. Can a company keep doing that forever? I'm going to say yes. This I'm less worried about because the company's basically been in that 38% range for, historically, and now JP Morgan's forecasting it's going to stay that way. So me forecasting it's going to stay that way seems a little bit less dangerous than saying anything about revenue. Again, we're going to revisit the revenue issue down the road and really break down this revenue forecast into its core drivers. Later on in this course, we're going to go down to the nitty-gritty of, well, how many iPhones do we think Apple's going to sell? How many iPads are they going to sell? How many units as opposed to the average sale price of each unit? That's how granular JP Morgan has to get to make these forecasts. And we're going to walk through that process. It's called a price volume analysis. We're just going to do it a little bit later. Right now, we're just sort of aggregating. This is the line item, and we're going to call it a day. Okay, so I'm going to stop right there. What I'd like you to do at this point is hit the pause button. You've got enough information to fill out the rest of this. Again, I've highlighted it to make it easy for you to where to find this. When you're done highlighting this, or when you're done, I should say, inputting this, then I'd like you to fill out this model, the face of this. You have enough information. You can now forecast absolute revenue data, absolute cost of goods sold data, etc. The only thing you can't quite do is the stuff that's shaded out. You cannot forecast interest income yet or interest expense. You cannot forecast depreciation, amortization. But you can do everything else. give that a shot. And when you're ready to move on to the next video, you're going to watch me complete this in case you were struggling.